Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even in the stillness of solitude? Arthur Levesque, a struggling writer seeking inspiration, was about to uncover a secret buried deep in the shadows of an old cabin. His story is one of mystery, terror, and the terrifying realization that some things are never meant to be discovered. Before we descend into this chilling tale, subscribe to Labyrinth of the Mind, where every story peels back another layer of fear. Hit the bell icon, because what you're about to hear may make you question the very fabric of reality itself. Arthur's journey began on a cold, overcast afternoon. The sky hung low, a blanket of ominous gray that seemed to press against the dense forest surrounding the cabin. The air was heavy, carrying the damp smell of moss and decaying leaves. As he approached the secluded retreat, an unsettling silence greeted him. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to thicken with each step. The cabin was small and weathered, its wooden exterior darkened with age and streaked by the relentless assault of rain and time. The windows, smeared with dust and cobwebs, stared out like blind eyes, giving the impression of something ancient and sentient waiting inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dim interior. The faint scent of mildew mixed with a peculiar metallic tang filled his nostrils, making him hesitate before stepping across the threshold. Inside, the cabin was sparsely furnished. A rickety chair, a warped wooden table, and a fireplace that looked as though it hadn't been used in decades. But in the corner of the room, half hidden by shadows, something caught his eye. It was an antique typewriter, its black frame gleaming faintly despite the lack of light. The sight of it sent a shiver down his spine, though he couldn't explain why. He told himself it was just a machine, but deep down, a primal instinct whispered a warning he couldn't ignore. As Arthur approached the typewriter, the air seemed to grow colder. The keys were worn, their letters faded from years of use, and the carriage return lever was slightly bent. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, and for a moment he thought he heard a faint clicking sound, as if the machine was alive, breathing in the silence. He shook his head and laughed nervously, brushing off the sensation as his imagination playing tricks on him. But as he turned to explore the rest of the cabin, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the small space, making his heart race. Turning back, he froze. The typewriter, untouched, sat eerily still, yet a piece of paper had appeared in its roller. The words typed on it were chilling. "Welcome home, Arthur." Terror gripped him as he stepped back, his mind racing for an explanation. He hadn't touched the typewriter. No one else could have been there. The forest was empty, and the cabin's isolation was supposed to be its charm. Yet, here he was, staring at a message that felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Before he could make sense of the situation, the faint sound of typing began to echo through the room. The keys moved on their own, slow and deliberate, as if the machine was savoring each stroke. Arthur's breath hitched as he watched, paralyzed by fear. The words forming on the paper were unmistakable. The story has already begun. His skin prickled as a cold sweat ran down his back. Was this a joke? A hallucination? Or had he walked into something far darker than he could ever imagine? With trembling hands, he reached for the paper, but as his fingers touched it, the typewriter stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with an unspoken threat. Arthur realized he was no longer just a writer looking for inspiration. He was a character in a story he couldn't escape, and the typewriter wasn't finished yet. Arthur awoke in the dead of night, drenched in sweat. The sound of typing echoed through the cabin, faint but deliberate, like someone pressing each key with a cruel sense of purpose. He sat up, his heart pounding, and glanced at the corner where the typewriter stood. In the darkness, its silhouette loomed unnaturally large, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls as if the machine itself were alive, watching. The air in the cabin was heavy, suffocating. Arthur could feel it pressing against his skin, a weight that seemed to crawl into his lungs. The faint smell of burning paper filled the room, acrid and sharp, though there was no fire to be seen. He forced himself out of bed, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor that creaked beneath his weight, each step a whisper of protest. The typing stopped abruptly as he approached the desk, replaced by an eerie, consuming silence that made his ears ring. A single piece of paper sat in the typewriter's roller, illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the grimy window. Arthur hesitated, his breath shallow, before reaching out to pull the sheet free. The words were clear, typed in jagged, uneven lines as though the machine had struggled to spit them out. You cannot rewrite the inevitable. His hands trembled, the paper slipping from his grasp and floating to the floor. A sharp knock echoed from the cabin door, shattering the silence and nearly causing Arthur to collapse from fright. He turned sharply, his pulse roaring in his ears. No one should be there. The cabin was miles from civilization, buried deep in the woods, its only visitor meant to be solitude. Yet the knocking continued, insistent and deliberate, as though whoever, or whatever, stood on the other side had all the time in the world. He approached the door cautiously, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. His hand hovered over the latch, hesitating as another knock, louder this time, reverberated through the wood. Swallowing his fear, he flung the door open, only to be greeted by a wall of darkness. The forest beyond was still, unnaturally so, the usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive silence. Then he saw it. At the edge of the treeline, barely visible in the dim moonlight, stood a figure, a man, or at least something resembling one. Its outline was twisted, blurred as if it didn't belong to the world around it. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, but Arthur felt its eyes on him, piercing and inescapable. His chest tightened as a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut, the force of it throwing him back against the desk. The typewriter began to hum, its keys clattering on their own with feverish speed. Arthur turned to see the machine spitting out line after line of text, faster than any human hand could manage. He staggered to his feet and leaned over to read the fresh page. It described, in horrifying detail, his exact movements from the moment he'd awakened. But the last line was what made his blood run cold. The visitor is not gone. He is inside. Arthur spun around, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, darker than they had any right to be, as though something hidden within them was stirring, waiting. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, but not from outside, from within the cabin, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. He grabbed the paper and threw it into the fireplace, lighting a match with shaking hands. The flames roared to life, consuming the page, but as the words burned away, the typewriter began again, typing a single phrase repeatedly. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The sound of the keys was deafening, drowning out Arthur's panicked thoughts. Terror consumed him as he realized the truth. This wasn't a dream. The typewriter wasn't just writing his story, it was controlling it. And no matter how far he ran or how desperately he tried to escape, the ending had already been written. He wasn't the author. He was the victim, and the machine would ensure that his story was the perfect tragedy. Arthur tried to convince himself that what he experienced was just exhaustion, the product of an overworked mind unraveling in the isolation of the cabin. Yet, as the days dragged on, the atmosphere grew heavier, as if the very walls of the cabin were closing in on him. The typewriter remained eerily silent during the day, but at night, it became a creature of its own, a malevolent force that refused to let him rest. One evening, Arthur sat staring at the typewriter, its black frame gleaming ominously under the dim light of the oil lamp. The air felt charged, thick with an unexplainable tension, like the moments before a storm. He decided to test the machine, hoping to prove that it was just an ordinary object. Taking a deep breath, he placed a blank sheet of paper in the roller and began to type. The man walked into the forest and never returned. As soon as he pressed the final key, the cabin shuddered. A low groan echoed through the floorboards, followed by a sharp gust of icy wind that extinguished the lamp. Arthur froze, his breath clouding in the sudden chill. The sound of faint footsteps emerged from outside, crunching on the dead leaves just beyond the cabin walls. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped directly beneath the window. Arthur's pulse raced as he turned his gaze to the glass. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then a face appeared, distorted, pale, and barely human. Its hollow eyes stared through the smeared window, locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. Before he could react, the face vanished, leaving only the faint imprint of breath fogging the glass. Panicking, Arthur grabbed the paper from the typewriter and ripped it into pieces, hoping to undo whatever he had triggered. But as the scraps fell to the floor, a strange hissing noise filled the room, like the sound of steam escaping under pressure. The typewriter began to type on its own again, the keys slamming down with an almost violent force. Each stroke felt deliberate, calculated, as if the machine was mocking him. Arthur watched in horror as the new text unfolded. The man didn't escape the forest. He's waiting for you. The cabin creaked, the sound coming from all directions, like a living, breathing entity surrounding him. Shadows began to dance across the walls, forming grotesque shapes that twisted and contorted unnaturally. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the corners of the room, but the beam did little to dispel the darkness. Instead, it illuminated a set of muddy footprints that hadn't been there before, leading from the door to the desk. Arthur's hands trembled as he traced the trail back to the typewriter. The footprints stopped abruptly at the base of the desk, as though the intruder had vanished into thin air. He spun around, feeling the oppressive weight of unseen eyes watching him, but the room appeared empty. His own reflection in the window startled him, his face pale, eyes wide with fear, until he noticed something horrifying. There was another figure behind him, barely visible in the glass, standing unerringly still. Arthur turned sharply, but no one was there. His breathing was shallow now, his chest tight with dread. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of paper. When he looked back at the typewriter, a new line had appeared on the page. It's already inside. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being hunted. Whatever force controlled the typewriter had seeped into his world, manipulating it to its will. The machine wasn't just predicting the future, it was creating it. And Arthur was its unwilling pawn, trapped in a story he could neither rewrite nor escape. He backed away from the desk, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, searching for some sign of what had invaded his life. But the shadows held their secrets, shifting only when he wasn't looking. Somewhere deep in the forest, a low, guttural growl echoed, sending shivers down his spine. The typewriter's keys began to move again, slow and deliberate. Arthur didn't dare approach it this time. He could hear the faint scratching of the paper being pulled through the roller, like nails on a chalkboard. When the typing stopped, he summoned the courage to step closer, his hands shaking as he read the newest message. Run, Arthur. But not too far. I'll always find you. He turned toward the door, but the cabin felt alive now, its very walls pulsing with a dark energy. The door refused to budge, as though the cabin itself had decided to trap him. He was no longer just a visitor. He was a prisoner in a story that wasn't his to tell. And the typewriter wasn't just a tool. It was a doorway to something far darker than Arthur could ever imagine. The footsteps outside resumed, slow and steady, circling the cabin like a predator savoring its prey. Arthur pressed his back against the wall, clutching the flashlight tightly. The light flickered, its beam growing weaker, as the sound of the typewriter filled the room once more. It wasn't finished with him, and neither was whatever waited outside. Arthur's sleep that night was restless, filled with vivid, disjointed dreams that felt more like memories than fantasies. He saw himself sitting at the typewriter, but it wasn't the cabin around him. It was a vast, empty void. The machine's keys moved on their own, typing words he couldn't control, and each word echoed like a scream in the abyss. A cold, metallic voice whispered, "You don't write the story, Arthur. The story writes you." He awoke with a gasp, his body drenched in sweat, and his heart racing like a drumbeat in his chest. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint, unnatural glow coming from the typewriter. Its presence dominated the room, exuding a palpable menace that made the air feel heavy and oppressive. Arthur's breathing slowed as he stared at the machine, now somehow closer to his bed than it had been the night before. He wanted to ignore it, to believe that it was just another nightmare, but the machine wouldn't let him. The keys began to move again, slow at first, then faster, their rhythmic clattering reverberating through the cabin like a death march. Arthur swung his legs over the side of the bed, his bare feet meeting the icy floor as he cautiously approached the desk. The paper in the roller was blank, yet the sound continued, as if the typewriter was typing on nothingness itself. Then, the words began to appear, burning themselves into the page like invisible ink revealed by flame. "Look behind you." Arthur froze, every muscle in his body tensing as the words seared themselves into his mind. He didn't want to turn, but the feeling of something breathing down his neck was too overwhelming to ignore. Slowly, he twisted his head, the dim glow of the typewriter casting long, flickering shadows across the room. At first, there was nothing but darkness. But then a shape began to emerge from the shadows, a figure tall and emaciated, its limbs too long and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Its hollow, black eyes locked onto Arthur, and a jagged grin spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The creature didn't move, but Arthur could feel its presence suffocating him, pressing against his chest like an unseen weight. Panicking, he stumbled backward, knocking over the chair as he grabbed the typewriter and hurled it across the room. The machine hit the wall with a deafening crash, but instead of breaking, it landed upright on the floor, completely intact. Its keys began to move again, this time faster than ever, as though mocking his futile attempt to destroy it. The words on the paper shifted, forming a new sentence. You cannot destroy what has already begun. The cabin itself seemed to react, its walls groaning and bending inward as if alive. The once familiar space became a nightmarish distortion, with doors and windows melting into the walls, leaving Arthur trapped. The glow from the typewriter intensified, bathing the room in an eerie, flickering light that cast impossible shadows. Desperate, Arthur turned to the fireplace, its embers still faintly glowing from earlier that evening. He grabbed the pages that the typewriter had printed, now scattered across the desk, and threw them into the flames. The fire roared to life, consuming the paper, but as the pages burned, the typewriter's keys slammed down violently, typing a single word over and over. Stop. The flames hissed and sputtered, as if fighting against some unseen force, and the cabin filled with a deafening roar. Arthur fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside his own skull. The creature in the shadows began to move, its jerky, unnatural motions bringing it closer and closer. Suddenly, the typewriter stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise, a void so complete that it felt like the world itself had ceased to exist. Arthur looked up, his vision blurred by tears of fear and exhaustion, and saw the typewriter glowing brighter than ever. The machine emitted a low hum, vibrating with an otherworldly energy. A new sheet of paper emerged from the roller, blank at first, but as Arthur watched, words began to appear, not typed but carved into the surface as if by invisible claws. You belong to me now. The creature lunged, its grotesque form enveloping Arthur in darkness. His scream echoed through the cabin, but no one was there to hear it. The glow from the typewriter faded, leaving the room bathed in cold, suffocating blackness. When the light of dawn finally broke through the forest, the cabin was eerily silent. Inside, the typewriter sat on the desk, pristine and untouched, as if nothing had happened. But in the roller, a new sheet of paper had been fed, bearing a final message. The end is only the beginning. Arthur was gone. Only his name remained, scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting at the bottom of the page. Arthur awoke on the cold, wooden floor of the cabin, his body aching as if he had been running for hours. The typewriter sat silently on the desk, its presence looming like a predator waiting for its prey to stir. He stared at it with a mixture of fear and loathing, the events of the previous night flashing through his mind like fragmented memories of a terrible dream. But when he glanced at his hands, stained with soot and faintly trembling, he knew it had been all too real. Determined to find answers, Arthur began to search the cabin, pulling open drawers and rifling through the dusty shelves. He needed to understand what this thing was, why it had chosen him, and how to escape its grasp. In the bottom drawer of the desk, hidden beneath a stack of faded, yellowed papers, he found an old leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and worn, the edges frayed, as if it had endured years of neglect. Inside, the journal belonged to a man named Elias Greaves, a reclusive writer who had lived in the cabin decades ago. The first few pages described mundane entries about his daily routine, his struggles with writer's block, and his search for inspiration. But as Arthur flipped through the journal, the tone shifted dramatically. Elias began to write about the typewriter, referring to it as the Oracle. According to the entries, the machine had been a gift, or perhaps a curse, from an anonymous benefactor. It had arrived one stormy night, left on the doorstep with no note or explanation. At first, Elias believed it to be a simple antique, but when he began to use it, he discovered its horrifying power. "It knows me," Elias wrote in shaky script. "It knows my fears, my desires, and the darkness I hide even from myself. It writes what I cannot bear to confront." The journal became increasingly erratic, filled with cryptic warnings and desperate pleas. Do not trust it. It will show you the future, but only the worst parts. Elias described how the machine began predicting events with uncanny accuracy. First, small details. A storm that arrived earlier than forecast, a deer killed on the road near the cabin. But then the visions turned darker, deaths, accidents, and betrayals, each one unfolding exactly as the typewriter foretold. Arthur's stomach churned as he read further. Elias had tried to destroy the machine, just as Arthur had. He burned it, smashed it, even tried burying it deep in the woods. But every time, it returned to the desk, pristine and waiting. The final entry was short and smeared with ink, as if written in a frenzy. The Oracle doesn't just predict. It commands. I am no longer writing. It is writing me. Arthur slammed the journal shut, his breathing ragged. He looked at the typewriter, now seemingly dormant, and felt an overwhelming urge to run. But when he glanced at the floor, he noticed something strange. a trail of faint footprints leading from the desk to the door. They were his own, but he hadn't walked there. The implication sent chills down his spine. The typewriter had made him move without his awareness, pulling him like a marionette. He grabbed the journal and stepped outside, desperate for fresh air and distance from the cursed machine. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive with hidden intent. As he walked, he opened the journal again, flipping to the last page. There, scrawled in shaky handwriting that wasn't Elias's, were the words, "You were chosen, Arthur." Suddenly, Arthur stumbled upon something half buried in the dirt, a rusted metal plaque. He brushed away the soil to reveal a single word etched into the surface. Greaves. It was a grave marker. The realization hit him like a blow. Elias Greaves had never left the cabin. He had died here, claimed by the same force that now targeted Arthur. The ground beneath the plaque was disturbed, as if something had recently been unearthed. Arthur's mind raced with questions. Had someone or something dug Elias up? And why? A faint sound drew his attention back toward the cabin, a rhythmic clicking that he recognized instantly. The typewriter was at work again. Arthur sprinted back, his heart pounding with a mix of terror and adrenaline. When he burst through the door, the machine had already finished. A single sheet of paper sat in the roller, waiting for him to read it. His hands shook as he pulled it free and scanned the text. The words were a direct continuation of what he had just experienced, describing his discovery of the grave and his desperate dash back to the cabin. But the final line froze him in place. Tonight, he joins the story. Arthur felt the air grow colder, the shadows in the room deepening. He turned toward the door, but it was no longer there, just a solid wall where the exit had been moments ago. The cabin had trapped him, just as it had Elias, and the typewriter continued to hum softly, as though savoring its latest victim. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the silence. Arthur realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just reading the story. He was the story, and the typewriter was far from finished. Arthur sat in the suffocating silence of the cabin, his mind racing as he tried to piece together an escape. The typewriter had gone quiet, its stillness more menacing than the frantic clattering of its keys. The words on the last page, "Tonight he joins the story," replayed in his mind like a haunting melody, refusing to let him rest. He knew he couldn't stay, but every attempt to leave was thwarted by an unseen force. Desperate for answers, Arthur decided to delve deeper into the journal of Elias Greaves, hoping to uncover some clue that could help him. By candlelight, he pored over the frantic scrawls of a man consumed by the same darkness that now ensnared him. One passage stood out, written in large, shaky letters that seemed more like a warning than a record. "The Oracle demands a story, and if you don't write it, it will write you out." Arthur realized with growing dread that the typewriter wasn't just a tool. It was an entity, feeding on the narratives it created. The stories weren't merely predictions, they were commands, shaping reality around the writer's unwilling hand. And now it had chosen him. Determined to confront the truth, Arthur ventured outside, the journal tucked under his arm. The forest was cloaked in an unnatural darkness, the faint light of the moon barely penetrating the dense canopy above. As he wandered deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the crunch of dead leaves beneath his boots. The trail led him to an old, crumbling shed hidden among the trees. Its walls were warped with age, and the door hung ajar, swaying slightly as though inviting him inside. Arthur hesitated, but a strange compulsion drew him forward. Inside, the air was damp and foul, reeking of decay. The faint glow of his flashlight revealed shelves lined with rotting papers, broken tools, and dusty artifacts. But what caught his attention was a stack of typewritten pages, neatly arranged on a table in the center of the room. The pages bore the same jagged typeface as the messages from the typewriter in the cabin. Arthur's hands trembled as he picked up the first page. It was a story, one that mirrored Elias's journal, but included details that had never been written down. The pages recounted Elias's final days, describing his growing paranoia and eventual descent into madness. But what truly chilled Arthur was the final sentence of the last page: "The Oracle's work is never done. It always needs a new author." Suddenly, a noise echoed behind him, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on his neck stand on end. He spun around, flashlight trembling, but the beam illuminated nothing but shadows that seemed to ripple and twist as though alive. The growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. Arthur stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering, and the stack of papers toppled to the floor. Among them, he saw something horrifying, a photograph of himself, sitting at the typewriter in the cabin. He hadn't posed for this picture. He hadn't seen a camera. Yet there it was, proof that whatever haunted this place knew him intimately. The growl turned into a deep, rasping voice, whispering his name. Arthur. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head, reverberating like an echo in a cavern. He dropped the flashlight, its beam rolling across the shed, and ran. He sprinted through the forest, branches clawing at his face and arms as though the woods themselves were trying to keep him. The air seemed thicker with every step, slowing him down, forcing him to gasp for breath. When he finally burst back into the clearing, the cabin stood before him, its windows glowing faintly like eyes in the dark. But something was different. The cabin seemed larger, its shape distorted, as if the structure had warped to accommodate something monstrous inside. The typewriter's clattering echoed through the walls, louder and more frenzied than ever. Arthur hesitated at the threshold, but the door creaked open on its own, inviting him back into the nightmare. Inside, the typewriter sat at the desk, a new page waiting in its roller. The words already printed there made his stomach drop. The author cannot abandon the story. Arthur screamed at the machine, demanding to know what it wanted. But the typewriter answered only with silence, its keys still. Then the shadows in the room began to shift, pooling in the corners and rising like smoke. From the darkness emerged a figure, tall, gaunt, and faceless, its form flickering as though it were made of static. The entity pointed to the typewriter, its movements deliberate and menacing. Arthur knew what it wanted. It wasn't asking him to write. It was demanding it. He sat at the desk, his hands trembling as he placed them on the keys. The moment he began to type, the room seemed to exhale, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Words poured from his fingers, describing the events of the night in horrifying detail. It was as if the story was writing itself, his hands merely instruments of the machine's will. But as he typed, Arthur noticed something terrifying. The story wasn't ending. The events it described were moving forward, beyond what he had experienced, detailing his future in vivid, agonizing clarity. The final sentence formed on the page as his hands moved against his will, and as he finished the story, the door behind him closed for the last time. Arthur turned, tears streaming down his face, as the door slammed shut, sealing him inside. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was his prison, and the typewriter his captor. And somewhere in the darkness, the shadows whispered, "Welcome to your story, Arthur. You'll never leave it." Arthur sat hunched over the typewriter, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the keys. He had written everything it demanded. Every fear, every twisted event, every dark revelation. Yet the typewriter's hunger remained insatiable. The room around him felt alive, pulsing with an unseen force, the air heavy and thick as if the cabin itself was breathing. Shadows writhed along the walls, coalescing into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at him with malevolent intent. Suddenly, the typewriter fell silent, the clattering of its keys ceasing abruptly. Arthur froze, his breath shallow, waiting for the next move. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards as if something unseen was pacing just out of sight. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed the glow from the typewriter dimming, the light retreating into the machine like a predator preparing to strike. Then, the final page emerged from the roller, blank except for a single line at the top. "Face the author of your story." Arthur's chest tightened as the walls of the cabin began to warp and twist, the wood groaning under an unseen pressure. The shadows deepened, their shapes solidifying into humanoid figures that loomed closer with every flicker of the dim oil lamp. The typewriter let out a low, guttural hum, vibrating against the desk. Arthur reached for the page, his fingers brushing the paper, and instantly, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Arthur was no longer in the cabin. He stood in a vast, endless void, the ground beneath him cold and reflective like black glass. The only sound was the echo of his own breathing. In the distance, a faint clicking echoed, typewriter keys, relentless and mechanical, growing louder with every step he took. The void began to shift, shapes forming out of the darkness. Arthur saw fragments of his life, like snapshots frozen in time. There was his childhood home, a window with rain streaking down the glass. His first book signing, the crowd a blur of unfamiliar faces. And then darker memories. A fight with his estranged brother, the funeral he had avoided, the night spent drowning in regret as he stared at an empty page. Each memory felt invasive, as if the void itself was peeling back the layers of his soul. At the center of this surreal landscape stood a massive, grotesque machine, a typewriter, but far larger and more sinister than the one in the cabin. Its keys were made of bone, its carriage a twisted amalgamation of flesh and metal that pulsed like a beating heart. It seemed alive, exuding a dark energy that made Arthur's skin crawl. As he approached, a figure emerged from the shadows beside the typewriter. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form flickering like static on a broken screen. Its face, or lack thereof, was a void, a blank canvas that seemed to absorb the light around it. The figure raised a long, spindly finger and pointed at Arthur, its presence overwhelming and suffocating. "You are not the writer," it said in a voice that resonated like 1,000 whispers layered atop one another. "You are the story." Arthur staggered backward, his mind reeling. He shouted at the figure, demanding to know what it wanted from him, but his voice felt small and insignificant in the vast emptiness. The figure tilted its head, as if amused by his defiance, and with a flick of its hand, the massive typewriter sprang to life. The keys clattered with deafening speed, each stroke echoing like a thunderclap. Words began to appear in the air around Arthur, glowing faintly before dissolving into the darkness. They described his every movement, every thought, every desperate plea for escape. Arthur steps forward, his hands trembling. He cannot run. He cannot fight. He belongs to the story now. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. This wasn't just a story he was living. It was his fate, orchestrated by the machine and its faceless master. He tried to resist, to move away from the typewriter, but his body refused to obey. His legs carried him forward, each step deliberate and controlled, until he stood directly before the grotesque machine. The figure leaned closer, its featureless face inches from his own. "You were chosen because your life was empty, Arthur," it whispered. "You gave up on your story, so we wrote one for you. But every story needs an ending." Arthur's hands moved against his will, reaching for the keys. He screamed, fighting the invisible force that guided him, but it was no use. His fingers began to type, each letter sealing his fate. The words appeared before him, describing his final moments with horrifying clarity. Arthur writes the ending, his mind unraveling as the story consumes him. He types the last sentence, and the void swallows him whole. Tears streamed down his face as the final sentence formed beneath his trembling hands. The end. The moment he pressed the period, the void collapsed around him. The typewriter dissolved into the darkness, and Arthur felt himself being pulled into the nothingness, his body weightless, his thoughts scattering like ashes in the wind. His scream echoed once, then was silenced forever. When the light returned to the cabin, the typewriter sat quietly on the desk, pristine and unassuming. A new sheet of paper was loaded into the roller, bearing a single line of text. Another story awaits. And somewhere, in the shadows of another life, a new author was chosen. The cabin was silent once more, but not peaceful. The typewriter sat on the desk, motionless, its polished keys gleaming faintly in the dim light. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with a sinister energy that seemed to pulse from the machine. On the desk, a fresh sheet of paper was loaded into the roller, bearing a chilling message. Another story begins. Arthur was gone. No trace of him remained except for the faint scent of burning paper lingering in the air and the overturned chair by the desk. Yet, the cabin felt far from empty. The walls seemed to hum with a low vibration, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface, as if the building itself had absorbed his presence. The shadows that danced along the edges of the room twisted unnaturally, shapes forming and dissolving as though something unseen moved just out of reach. Outside, the forest stood eerily still. The trees, once a natural refuge, now loomed like towering sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. A thick mist crept through the undergrowth, curling around the base of the cabin, as if to keep whatever horrors lay within contained. The trail leading to the cabin, once clear, had disappeared, swallowed by the encroaching wilderness. It was as if the cabin had been erased from the world, existing now only as a prison for its next victim. Far away, in the city Arthur had left behind, his name began to fade. His neighbors forgot the man who had once lived among them. His friends dismissed his absence as if he had never existed. The only trace of his life was a faint memory lingering in the back of their minds, a shadow that refused to take shape. It was as though the story had reached beyond the cabin, rewriting reality itself. Meanwhile, deep within the cabin, the typewriter began to hum faintly. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a clock counting down to an inevitable end. Slowly, its keys began to move, typing out words that seemed to form of their own volition. The author has been consumed. The story is incomplete. The next begins now. Somewhere miles away, a young woman sat in a crowded library, flipping through an old leather-bound book. As she turned the brittle pages, Her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper wedged between two chapters. Curiosity sparked in her mind as she unfolded it. Typed neatly across the page was a single sentence: "The cabin awaits you." Her heartbeat quickened as she stared at the words, a cold shiver running down her spine. She didn't recognize the handwriting, and yet, the words felt personal, as if they were written just for her. The air around her seemed to shift, growing colder despite the warmth of the library. A shadow passed over her, though no one else appeared to notice. When she looked up, the room seemed darker, the faces of the other patrons blurred and indistinct. Back in the cabin, the typewriter's hum grew louder, its keys moving more frantically now, typing out an address, a location far from the woman's home, in a part of the country she had never visited. The paper slid from the roller and fluttered to the floor, the words glowing faintly before fading into the darkened wood. The machine paused, as if satisfied, before going silent once more. The cabin, now shrouded in mist, seemed to breathe, its walls expanding and contracting with a life of their own. The faint sound of laughter echoed through the empty rooms, low, guttural, and otherworldly. The shadows danced more violently, their shapes forming faces that leered and sneered before dissolving into darkness. The typewriter sat waiting, patient and eternal, its hunger for stories insatiable. It didn't care who came next or what they wrote. It cared only for the ending, for the moment when the author's life would become part of its endless narrative. And somewhere, beyond the forest, another unsuspecting soul was already on their way, drawn by the invisible threads of fate woven by the machine. The cabin stood as it always had, a sentinel of terror hidden deep within the forest, its stories endless and its victims countless. And so the question remains, if you found that cabin, would you walk inside? If this story has sent a shiver down your spine, leave your theories in the comments. What do you think happened to Arthur, and who or what controls the typewriter? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Labyrinth of the Mind, and share it with someone who loves unraveling mysteries. Remember, every story has an ending, but not every ending is final. See you in the next tale, if you dare.